I really am excited about this session. I can say that it was my personal desire to have David joining and talking to our group. So to fit our new theme of friends around the world, this was part of it, and I am really excited about this session. So I'm not going to talk too much. Thank you everyone that is joining on this Monday gloomy. You had nothing else to do because it's such a bad weather out there. So this is the place to be. And thank you, David, for offering your time and your thoughts and your experience and everything you're going to share with us. I am really looking forward to this. Agile Ontario is in this series of events with friends around the world. So we are inviting people from everywhere around the world. We have some sessions already planned and more coming up, but I want to hear everything you want to share with us today, and I'm gonna let you lead the conversations.
Cool. Well, thanks for reaching out and including me in your world tour here. So I'm gonna share my screen. I don't have slides for you all today. I'm just gonna be using Mural. And then we'll do some activities later on, so it's not just me talking. But yeah, I don't know, like, where's my background? I kind of grew up in the Agile community, so I see some familiar faces here in the participant list. Yeah, I was kind of thrown in. It's funny, the first startup I joined, we were about a year in or so. So I joined in 99, so it was like early 2000, 2001. And they said, we're Agile. And that was like all the training I got. So I was like, oh, okay, we're Agile. And we were like a fintech startup, and we were transferring all this money over the internet, like, which was not as common back then. And, a failed sprint meant like we pack up the startup and go home. It was that kind of pressure. So I learned a lot of bad habits early on. And then, finally started coming around to, okay, let me participate in the community and learn from everyone. So I've learned so much from the Agile community over the years. It's been really fun for me. And I've always taken this kind of startup approach with it. Whereas even though I work with big companies now, it's all about like, how do you test your way through the opportunity in an iterative way? So taking a lot of Agile into like business agility and lean startup and design thinking and business model innovation. So today I'm going to give you kind of an overview of the book I released last fall. So it's not quite a year old yet. It was released in November of 2018 with Alexander Osterwalder, who created the Business Model Canvas. So I will give you kind of what was the thinking behind that book and what's in it. And then also we'll do an exercise, later on, just to kind of give you some practice with using some of the things in there. I'll paste the link to the mural board in a bit. Actually, well, I guess we could just paste it now. It's not a huge deal. I mean, but basically, I have an outline here for us. So introduction, I don't think we need a code of conduct. I use the Bill and Ted one, which is like kind of be excellent to each other. So, as far as like giving feedback and asking questions, is being respectful. I gave you a little bit of cheat sheet on how to use Mural if you haven't used it before. It's pretty simple. It's just double click and you can, all the command, copy paste stuff. It just works for the most part. But I locked everything down so you don't have to worry about like messing anything up. And then if we come up with stuff during the session, and sometimes I just ramble about, I'm so used to promoting other people's books. So I'll just paste some useful link stuff in here if we wanted to, explore other things that I mentioned. And then we're going to hold questions at the end. So, basically, if you want to type a question in the box number 4 here with questions, you could ask like, I don't know, how does this work for B2B, which is always a question I get. So, and you can resize it, everything. So basically, this is a great way for us just to collect questions along the session. And, we'll come back and revisit and try to answer them all if we can. Okay. All right. So, but let's like jump into some of the content here, and I can give you maybe a little behind the scenes picture of kind of how we're thinking about it, and draw some here for you. So, a lot of so my co-author Alexander Osterwalder, he wrote this book. It's like 10, I think it's 10 years old now. So Lean Startup from Eric Ries and Business Model Generation from Alexander Osterwalder are pretty close. I think are 10 years old now. And so the concepts shouldn't be considered new, but I think we're still in the early adopter stage. It's like 10 years into Agile, and I felt like we were still in the early adopter stage. Maybe we still are in Agile, I don't know. But we get really frustrated when we want to jump ahead, but people need like some really strong foundational level, help a lot of the time. And we always want to jump ahead to kind of the more sophisticated stuff. But in reality, people are still working through some of the early day stuff with both these concepts of business model design and lean startup. And so what we ended up doing was, and people would sketch out their canvases, their business model canvas, and they would kind of get stuck on, okay, where's my risk and what would I do next and how would I experiment? And so we're really pulling from kind of design thinking and some of these ideas of desirability, viability, and feasibility of, all right, can we start layering some thinking on top of these tools to help people focus? Because pretty much everyone's seen this canvas. Like every accelerator I go into, even virtually now, they've already filled one out, although it's really usually poorly filled out, but a lot of people have been kind of exposed to it. But I mean, there's kind of a flow that I wanted to share with you all and kind of go from there. So really, I almost always start here in the middle, which is like, what's your value proposition? And then who's your customer? And so it's not always, it's probably 9 times out of 10, I either start here or here, because it's almost like natural. If you're going to try to create something new, you want to be able to say, what's the outcome or the value they get from it? And then who are the customers I'm going to reach? And then, basically, how do you reach them? So what are the channels, like acquisition channels to get to them, but also distribution channels? Like how do I, deploy my product to these customers? And then what kind of relationships do I have with them? And I would say out of the whole canvas, this is usually the box people mess up, because it's just weird to think about, like, what's my relationship with the customer? And is it transactional or is it ongoing? And how do we do loyalty and all that? And so my advice to you would be, if you're using these with your teams, try not to get too stuck on that box. Feel free to jump ahead and come back to it later, because I feel like a lot of teams go, what's a relationship? And then they'll argue about that or debate it healthily, for way too long. And then what are the revenue streams that we generate? So if you notice, a lot of what I end up doing is on the kind of right side. I don't go left or right. I had the pleasure of working with Toyota, and when I introduced this to Toyota, they said this is like a bento box, and I thought that was a really cool concept. They're like, oh no, you don't start on the left of your box, you start like here, and then you move here and here. So I really liked the way they described it. But I tend to start with a lot of desirability risk. Who's your customer, the value, how do you reach them, what's kind of that relationship like? And then, touching on viability. So the kind of, should we be doing this? This is a financially viable thing. Doesn't mean it doesn't. Sometimes it's free, right? So like if I work with Adobe, we'll launch free apps, but then they kind of lead people into the Creative Cloud sort of subscription model, right? And so it doesn't mean it's like you always have to charge for it right on the spot, but it should lead into, meaningful revenue for the company or some kind of KPI that you're moving. And then I jump to the back of saying, okay, so what are the activities we need to be doing? So what are the verbs? Sort of think of like the major verbs you need. What are the resources? So think nouns, digital and physical. It could be patents. It could be physical things like hardware. What are the key things you need? And then what's that cost? And so you could usually derive your costs a lot from your activities and your resources that you need to kind of make the business work. And then finally, I talk about partners. And usually it's like a system. I spent a week with Alex, before we even wrote the book, in Switzerland, going through like, how did you actually come up with this tool? Because I'd never heard kind of the origin story. Henry Chesborough has a white paper on it where he kind of lays it out, but I really wanted to hear from Alex and Eve, his kind of co-founder, of like, how did you actually create this thing? And he said, well, it was like a systems diagram at first. And I don't know, I don't have the image here, but it was sort of like, okay, so value prop, you deliver it to the customer, right? Your relationship is like this bi-directional relationship with them. And then you generate revenue through, some way through acting with your customer, right? And they're generating revenue for the thing. And then on the backstage, you get your activities and your resources. You can kind of derive your costs from there. And then if you're partnering somebody, they're bringing an activity or a resource to help you create your value prop, something like that build, borrow, buy conversation of, hey, we're partnering with them because we can't do this on our own. Sometimes, they also maybe create a channel for you to reach your customers, and that's why you partner with them. But it's funny, it kind of ended up looking like a canvas, but when he was talking about it, it was very much like a systems thinking like model. It almost looked like, I mean, it's not proper, systems thinking, but it's really close to this diagram of, oh, well, this is how this relates to this and this relates to this. And then it kind of just ended up being a canvas. And so when we're walking through, okay, let's layer risk on top of this, a lot of this is desirability, which would kind of this do they question from design thinking. I first learned this kind of framing from IDEO, but then you trace it back to Stanford D School, and then trace that back to like Larry Keeley and the Keeley triangle, and you trace that back to Chicago Institute of Design. It's really hard to trace some of this back properly. I just credit like pretty much a slew of people, but it works pretty well, this kind of desirability theme. And then viability down here, this kind of should we question, you're looking at the cost and revenue. Obviously, you have to have some kind of moral compass here too of, should we ethically be pursuing this? But from a financial viability point of view, it's kind of like, does the cost way more than the revenue? Hopefully not. And then the backstage with feasibility, it's a lot around the can we kind of question. So can we execute? It's not always technical feasibility. I know, in the Agile community, we obviously have a lot of expertise in technical feasibility. Like, we'll use something like an XP Spike to understand, is this something we can even do? Just like the front end and the middle tier and the back end all talk together in a way where we could do a thin slice of this and run with it. But I want to challenge you to think almost beyond that, to think, especially you in heavily regulated environments, it might work from a technical point of view, but then you get shut down because of regulatory reasons or other reasons like governance that prevent you from moving forward. So when I kind of disagree a little bit with the traditional framing of feasibility from a design thinking point of view, because I feel like it always comes back to just, can you build it? And in reality, you could build it, but then it still doesn't work because it doesn't actually adhere to other things that could shut it down. So things like governance and regulations and whatnot. Here in the United States, I work with a lot of health analytics companies or hospitals, and HIPAA compliance is a big thing where we can't actually expose patients' privacy through some kind of API or something. So just be mindful that feasibility does go beyond just technical feasibility. So if I kind of scroll down a little bit, I can give you maybe a more zoomed out view of what we attempt. There's pretty ambitious things to do in the book, which we which is all based on work I do. That's pretty much what the book's all about. So if you kind of look on the left here with the BMC, so the business model canvas, you'll notice that I just kind of color code the themes. So for example, desirability is a lot of these orange ones. So, what are the assumptions that we're making around our strategy? So what are the assumptions we're making around our value prop and our customer and our channels and all that? And then down at the bottom, we just write down a different color, like what are the assumptions we're making around viability? So things like cost and revenue. And then on the backstage, what are the assumptions we're making around the feasibility, whether we can actually build it or not? And, I like using the, what I kind of learned from Jeff Gothelf and Josh Seiden when I worked with them in EO, which like, we believe, that ... So I like starting things off that way of like, we believe that, this customer has this problem, right? And it just opens your team up to this notion that they could be wrong. And that's like half the battle, by the way, is like mindset shift of, hey, this isn't just a series of facts we go execute on and we burn down these like sprints and we're good. It's, oh, wow, we actually have some big assumptions here in our backlog. How would we sort of work through that and test our way through that and use what we've learned to kind of shape the backlog and shape what the ultimate solution could be. And so I feel like early Agile had that spirit, like that feedback loop goes out to the customer and back. I feel like sometimes we've lost that way where we have all these proxies in the middle and we actually don't know who the customer is anymore, which is not great. But I like coming back to the roots and going, okay, here's our strategy. We believe that, dot, dot, dot. And then let's move these over and basically map them. And so I created this little tool, again, working with Jeff and Josh, and then customizing it over the years, which I call assumptions mapping. There are other kinds of assumptions mapping out there, but it's basic 2x2 where I pull these over, and so you have these kind of desirability themes and these feasibility themes and these viability themes, and so they're all written down. And I'm lagging a little bit drawing here, but it's hopefully it'll come through. But basically, that stuff comes over, and essentially you decide on what's the most important thing that has the least amount of evidence. So for example, I find teams don't make the space to have this conversation. And so we kind of, like, if you're doing big agile, kind of like safe level stuff, you're kind of pulling these epics that are just giant assumptions where we haven't really thought through, how to kind of unpack them and talk about the assumptions we're making. These big, I mean, we're talking about like several sprints worth of work, right? These, like, if proven wrong, this will fail in a big way. And so I like this kind of important, unimportant axis where we talk about, like, this is important to the business. If this is wrong, if this is proven wrong, this belief we just wrote down, then we're going to fail in a big way, not in a kind of a small way. And then the have evidence, no evidence. It's really funny. If you look for old, examples of this online, I started with known and unknown, and I thought that would work. And it did for a while until I got really strong personalities in the room. Where I'd be like, why'd you put that sticky there? And they would say, well, I just know. I was like, okay, that's not what I'm aiming for. And then I would say, all right, let's do certain and uncertain. That'll fix it. And then they'll put it there. And I would say, like, why'd you put that there? And they would say, well, I'm certain. I'm like, well, how are you certain? And they would say, well, I just know. And I was like, no, we're just like back. And then finally working with Alex, he's like, why don't we just say have evidence and no evidence? And at first I was like, no, there's no way I'm changing this again, not even for this book. And, he eventually kind of won me over to say, okay, we'll just try it. And he tried it with a client, and, getting Alex to try anything, I don't know if he's not won over easily, right? So I had to wear him down on this. I remember we were at Stanford, and he was visiting to do a lecture at Stanford or something, and we were whiteboarding in a room at Stanford University. And I was like, this 2x2 works, man. You got to try it. And then he finally tries it, and then he goes, oh, this axis is all wrong, of course, because he's like a big conceptual thinker. And he's like, let's just try it. Have evidence and no evidence. And sure enough, like when we started doing it that way, people would put this sticky there, and I was like, well, how do you know? Did you have any evidence? They're, well, no, I don't have any evidence. I think finally getting to that conversation where we're talking about evidence. So this thing is just out there under Creative Commons. It's part of Google. So Google picked it up, and they use it to run their design sprints inside Google. And then it's on their website. I still think it's up there. They have like a sprint kit that they created that this is a part of too. And then I have, just random like templates out there for people too. But basically, like, getting them to have this conversation, and then kind of moving on to this next part where we say, all right, so there's like 44 different experiments that we can think through. Like, and this is where I felt like teams would get stuck. They would say, well, we have this kind of like risk, but then let's go do a landing page. And the landing page could be completely disconnected to the risk that you had. Or they're like, let's go interview some customers. And I was like, but you don't know how to build this. So like, interviewing customers isn't going to help you build it. Or let's run a survey. And it's like, all right, but a survey is really weak evidence, and people are just going to mess with you because they're surveys. And so you can't take that as really high strength of evidence and just run and build based on a survey. Like, how do you iterate your way through this over time? And people just had a really hard time, just thinking through what else is out there. I did interviews. I ran a survey. I might have designed a landing page, and then I should just build the whole thing. Like, what else can I do? And so just giving people the options, we pulled a lot from, existing things, like Luke Coman's innovation games and a lot of existing works out there of just, let's just map it back to saying, hey, if you have risk around the customer, yeah, there's all this amazing stuff you can do. But, if you have risk around pricing, what do you do? Or if you have risk around building, what do you do? And so just trying to give people a path forward. And so with that flow, we kind of, again, pretty ambitious. We went through and applied this taxonomy of like basically and don't read too much into the dots, but, you know, like how much does this cost? How much setup time and runtime? So like, you know, is this really expensive or not expensive at all? How long does it take to set up? And then how long should I run it? You know, based on what we've seen. And then probably one of the biggest ones is like the strength of evidence thing, because, and actually, you know, we probably should have went deeper in the book. I think if we update it to another edition, we're going to expand on this, because, you know, what people say versus what they do is sort of weak versus strong. You know, what people say is one thing, but what they do is another. What kind of currency you collect, you know, if you're collecting email, that's weaker than collecting payment information if you're buying something. Um, Lab versus real world, if you invite people into your office, back when we were able to do that, you know, they're kind of biased by a setting, you know, the office setting, and lab, like focus group type experiment. But if you're out there in the real world and doing it, it's, you know, a little different, right? Um, and so there's all these different kind of levers that you can kind of look at. And then we also included just like, hey, what do you need to run these experiments? So like, what kind of capabilities? And then you'll notice these themes kind of come up again as well: desirability, viability, feasibility. So, you know, when I was first writing this book, I thought, oh, this will be nice and clean. I'll just have a desirability section and a feasibility section and a viability section. And I've been, you know, doing this for quite some time. Those of you know me in the Agile community, I was probably like one of the first people to start giving lean startup talks, you know, so I've been all in on this for a while, and I got it completely wrong. I remember Alex and I and Alan, who's the designer on the other two books, you know, basically overlooking Lake Geneva and working on this book. And I was like, I can't organize it this way, because, you know, if you do this one kind of experiment, it could apply to all three, and I can't just duplicate things. So it took us a long time to figure out how to basically like come to grips with how to organize the book. And it works pretty well. And so basically down here, this is kind of the approach we chose. We said, okay, so let's go with kind of pulling from Steve Blank, who wrote Four Steps to Epiphany and has been a huge, kind of a huge influence on my career, and Eric Ries as well, which is, he frames this like customer discovery and customer validation. But we thought, okay, what if we go beyond just discovery? And what if we start thinking about what is overall like customer discovery, you know, beyond customer discovery into other types of discovery? What would that look like from a business point of view? You know, and so there's a lot of open-ended directional kind of experiments listed here that can help you match back to your risk that you have in your, you know, in your map. And then on the other side, we have validation experiments. And so things like, if you're further down the road and you want to, I tried to write a book without MVP, but I failed. I came close, but, you know, if you look at sort of the types of MVPs I put in the book, you know, things like concierge, where you manually deliver the value, you don't build almost anything at all. Wizard of Oz, which is kind of like concierge, but you, it's not obvious a person is involved. It's kind of behind some kind of curtain, whether it be digital or otherwise. Single feature MVP, where you just build that one thing. So it's like early days Foursquare, where you just checked in and that was all Foursquare did. Or, you know, Hotel Tonight, where it's like, I need a hotel tonight. It was a very, very niche thing. And then Mashup, I put in, I would say, I might have actually would have renamed that if I'd written this book later, because the no code movement is pretty much mashups. And no code is a lot of like, how do we wire Airtable into Zapier into like an unbounced page and something else? That's a lot of what's going on with mashups. It's like, can you mash up existing tech and not write any code, and then, you know, end up delivering value to the customer? So, so basically this is how we organized the book. And, you know, I won't go too deep into all these because, you know, we're limited time, but, you know, if you even take ads and you start looking at, okay, how would I treat an ad like an experiment? I was working with a really well-known company about mouth pain. And, you know, one of the things that we did early on is we don't know, we know people have mouth pain, but we're not sure, you know, if they would actually want our value proposition, which was like a solution to mouth pain. And if you take this kind of approach from Steve Blank, he'll say, okay, well, look for people that have the problem and that are aware of the problem and are actively seeking a solution. Well, the team I worked with, they kind of stopped here, right? And we said, oh, we'll just push ads to people that have mouth pain and they know they have mouth pain, right? So we use like Facebook and Twitter, and we're like, hey, this will work. And then, we only had like a 1% conversion on our landing page. I'm being really generous. It was pretty bad. And so the team almost gave up. And I said, hey, what if we do like a pull approach where we just use, like Google, what I would call like search only ads, which is a little different. It's like if you're searching in Google for mouth pain, is anybody searching? Well, we looked and we did some search trend analysis, and there were like tens of thousands of people searching for this thing. And we're like, oh, okay, let's do the same ad before we give up, and drop them in the same page. And we had a 40% conversion there, which is ridiculous. Like the most I'm usually aiming for is 10 to 15 with teams. And so little things like, can we treat acquisition like an experiment? How do we get our customers? Because quite often, I don't know how many you're in a big company versus small company, but like if I go to a big traditional company and I say, we have something completely new, we don't know the market very well, and we want you to run ads to help us find those people, to be like, you're crazy. I can run ads for this established product over here and hit my goals for the quarter. Or I could take a shot on trying to reach people that you're not even sure who they are, and do a bunch of trial and error over weeks and months. It's like really hard conversation to have. So I've been teaching acquisition to like scientists and chemical engineers and like all kinds of like crazy industries I work with. But like it's how they figure out how to get to their customer and how to kind of understand on their own versus just outsourcing it all. So it's been really, really interesting. And then another one is, something like Concierge, which is, when you manually do it all. I have a ton of stories about this, but, I think the one thing that jumps out to me with this kind of approach is that it always generates really strong evidence, because we're essentially doing it manually and delivering it to the end customer and getting their feedback on how satisfied they are. And so people always skip this because there's always this, well, I don't have time to do it manually, so I have to build it so it scales to millions of customers. It's such a weird conversation to have, because you're like, wait, we don't have time to test this for a month. We have time to build it so it'll scale. We don't even know we really, want this. And so I've worked on a lot of projects where, like some of the old early Adobe stuff, if you look at like Adobe Spark, for example, it was a lot of manual work. We had designers creating stuff for people and sending it back to them and then asking them how satisfied they were and if they used it or not. It's how we got down to the features we needed to launch the product. It's like I said, it's a little bit unlike Wizard of Oz, because it's obvious like there's a designer helping you. But we could have easily said, when they submitted the request, that we just magically sent them back an image without telling them a designer was involved, right? So we could have actually taken that approach too. But there are all these different ways that this is one of my favorite ones, because I always find that we learn so much, and it doesn't scale. It's okay. But you can learn so much by just manually doing it, as long as regulations allow it. There's so much you can learn. So enough of me kind of rambling on here. So basically what I wanted for us to do, and I'll kind of explain this at a high level before we jump in, is I kind of wanted you all to get maybe some practice, even if it's just for a few minutes on today's talk. So what I've done is I've included all the experiments from the book as PDFs here. So we have discovery and we have validation. And if you zoom in, I'm in move mode here, so let me take that off. If you, for example, don't know what a feature stub is, you can double click on it and it's going to open another PDF. And then you can zoom in if you like, or you can zoom in on the board. It's up to you. But then it gives you basically a description going, okay, this is like, oh, it's like a form of a button, but it's not a real button. And then, well, it doesn't take long, and it doesn't take long to set up and run, but then the evidence strength is pretty strong, even though we're just putting something out there. Like, before you build out your entire loyalty program, put a button in your app that says loyalty program for, in number of hours or days, and then, research, see how many people clicked on it and were interested in it. So there's all kinds of cool stuff that I've included in this board for you all. But what I wanted you to do was to think through, it's totally up to you what you want to use, but basically think of like a sequence that you would run on something you're trying to figure out right now that could help you figure out if you're on the right path or not. And that's so much of the work I do. I work with companies to kind of set up these innovation portfolios where they test, the last CEO I spoke to a couple weeks ago, he said he wanted to test 1,000 ideas over the next 5 years, and he knew over 90% of them would fail. And I thought, wow, that's amazing. And also I thought, you're going to need a process for that because you can't ad hoc test 1,000 ideas over 5 years. So that's a lot of the work that I do, is kind of pulling Agile up into a lot of the innovation space and a lot of like new product development space. But basically, I wanted you to think through not just one experiment, but at a sticky note level, what kind of experiments you might create to you might run to figure out if you're on the right track. So let's say, we'll just make it up as we go here. So what's a fun one? Sometimes at the Agile conferences, I create some fun ones. One of them was like, what if we used, augmented reality for like a story wall or storyboard, we'll say that. So if our idea is like, hey, we want to take somebody's story, like if they have stickies up on a wall, right? We're going to slap on augmented reality, and they're going to have an experience where they, like, all those stickies throw off all this other information, like how it ties into all these dependencies. And we don't have to go through all the details right now as far as like, the actual specs or anything. But, if I was tasked with something like this, I would probably almost always start with like customer interviews and just say, hey, like, is there any opportunity here before we jump to the solution? Is there anything that we should learn, the jobs to be done and pains of working with physical walls before we actually, go off and try to build something that's really expensive? I might also do something like what I would call a boomerang, where I would test maybe existing solutions or what people are doing now. What are the gaps that they have that could be filled, or maybe jobs that could be served if we applied something like AR to it. I might do some search trend analysis to find out, is anybody even searching for a problem or a solution around this sort of space online, based expanding from the people I spoke to. Maybe we go a little further and say, are there any kind of search volume? It's like tens of thousands, or maybe it's just tens. Like, how would we know? And then, maybe do something like probably do some like paper prototyping, really, to just really start off really low fidelity and try to sketch out what it could be, and kind of use that as props with customers. And then maybe go to something clickable at some point, like a clickable prototype. It still isn't quite the AR, but it's more of like, this is the kind of information you'd see if you looked at this board. What would you think? And then I might do, fast forwarding a little bit, I might be doing like some kind of mashup MVP where I kind of try to cobble together what AR could do if we, included all this stuff together. But what I try to convey here is, it's never just one, like, do some interviews and then go build the app. Almost never. It's always like, do the interviews, learn how wrong you are, and then go off and do something else and learn some more, and then kind of use that learning to inform the next thing. So I'm not looking for like a 20 experiment sequence here or anything like that. That wouldn't be very Agile of us. But looking through like, oh, if I had to explain to my sponsors what we're trying to do and where it might head, how could I explain that? It's kind of like, I keep feeling like the companies I join were like, oh my God, we're Agile and I have no idea where anything is, and I'm very nervous about it. That's similar for a lot of the discovery work I do, which is, we have no idea where this path is leading. And you go, well, based on what we learned here, we can take this forward into a little more expensive experiment where we can learn even more. And then we kind of make a overall investment decision on whether or not we're at the right track. So what I wanted to do was kind of give you some space to do this. So basically, you don't have to go too far, but think of something you're working on and look through these experiments, and just at a sticky level, say, hey, where would we start? And then what are like maybe 3 or 4 that we would run? It doesn't have to be much longer than that. And I'll give you some time here with a timer at the top. All right. So 5 minutes, just look through these, think of something you're on, and try to sketch out what would those experiments be that you might run to go learn if you're on the right track with the project. Okay.
Should we do a breakout room so they can talk with each other while they do this?
It's up to you. I usually just go on mute, but if you want to put people in rooms, that's cool too. This is the only board I have though, so they'd have to do it down here at the bottom, regardless.
Yeah. How does everyone want to do this? Do you want to like go into breakout rooms with 3-4 people and go through this together, or do you want to do it yourself?
Personally, I like to do it myself just because my situation can be different from everyone else's.
Okay. All right. Myself. Okay. Good. Okay. We have 2 myselfs. The others are not speaking, so I guess myself it is. Oh, we have a group. Myself. Oh, 3 myselfs and 1 group. Okay. Myself. Okay. Everyone will go on mute. Okay.
All right, I'm gonna set the timer for 5, and then basically afterwards, if you want to share one, we can choose some, and then we can jump in some Q&A too. Okay.
Awesome.
All right, so 5 minutes. Create an experiment sequence for something you feel like that you're working on, where it might help you know if you're on the right track. Right, and go.
I put the link again for some people that might have joined late.
You have 2 minutes left. All right, try to finish up. I love how their alarm sounds like a seatbelt.
My goodness, we forgot about those noises.
I know. Back when we used to fly. Cool. So maybe just really quickly, does anybody want to share something they came up with that they want to talk through?
If anyone is speaking, you're on mute.
I'll give it a shot if you want.
Go for it.
I don't know if I'm real familiar with all the concepts here, but take a shot at it anyway. So I was thinking, I had discussed this before, doing like a game online to help out some teams and perhaps lead into some sales, you know, some future sales of some coaching with the team. So my online game idea is a product, but I don't know how good that is or if it'll even be something that people would use. So I think I would start with a customer interview and just see if there's any appetite for it. Maybe do a discovery survey if I found there's one or two more people who showed some interest. I don't know if the speedboat thing fits in, but it intrigues me. So I think I would like to try that. And then maybe put some ideas together, see if it flies, and then maybe finish off with the buy a feature and see if what people are willing to spend money on. Does that kind of make sense?
Yeah, it does. And I think things like buy a feature and speedboat really just kind of cut through the blah, blah, blah. So for example, any kind of facilitated exercise you can do with a potential customer to help them visualize even what they're trying to say to you. So speedboat's really great because like the first time I ever used it was in a retrospective because we were like, as a team, what's slowing us down? So those were anchors. And the bigger, the deeper the anchor, the more kind of more it was kind of impeding our progress. And then you can even kind of modify it and say, oh, what are things that would help us go faster, right? And you can even draw like a sale or something too. So there are variants thereof. But when you do it for an interview, you could start talking about, okay, what are you trying to achieve? And then what's like in your way or slowing you down? And sometimes people just ramble, but I think if you facilitate it, then you can at least visualize it and then you start to get a better idea of like, oh, okay, this is the big thing that they're worried about. Because so often when I'm working with teams, we say like, oh, this is the top pain they have. And then we start talking to them and sure enough, it's some other thing that's really painful that it's not even on our list. So that can help.
I would like to go.
Sure.
Thank you. So I have pinky sticky notes on the board, and basically it's about revamping a portal where we have a service catalog. And it started by discovery survey and to collect more information about the preferences and wants of the customers and users. And then having a place where people will indicate their interest in joining a working group so that I can run a customer journey, I can create customer journey map. And basically it's done through an empathy map, customer journey map, yeah, and that's done through an empathy map, like with the working group. And then after that's gathering all the information and doing all the analysis, come up with clickable prototype and a mashup MVP so that to validate the output.
Very cool. Yeah, I think there's so much you can do without building. So even the clickable stuff, even though the backend doesn't work, there's so many like really major products I've worked on really early days where we just kind of hot zone things. And it's different than just talking to people or showing them a video. You get them to interact with something and yeah, it doesn't work all the way, but it's really powerful. And then also even with customer journeys, and I've had this, I even had this conversation with a Canadian company actually today by chance. I don't know why Canadians reaching out to me, but it's kind of cool. Which was inviting the client into the workshop. Because, you know, if you're filling out something like a value prop canvas or an empathy map, or you're doing some kind of journey mapping, having them there just shortens that feedback loop, you know? So it's not you take your best guess all of us distributed, and then go and find out, right? You can actually invite them in. So that's happened to me probably more often the last couple of years, where like I'm working with a healthcare company, and we would invite one of the clients in, and we would just basically work with them through it. And quite often we find that, oh, we didn't have these things ranked properly, or there was another job or pain or gain they had that we didn't really envision before. And so I think it depends on your customers, but if you can invite them in to kind of co-create stuff, that's super cool, because it actually even kind of shortens that feedback loop for you, instead of just like doing it your best guess and then going and finding out.
Thank you.
Cool.
David,
Okay,
but it will show real quickly how little I know about what we're talking about, and maybe we could use it as an experience of somebody who's totally naive in this area. So
sure. Where's yours at?
Or unless if you wanted to move on, that would be fine as well.
We can do one more. Yeah. Where is yours?
Mine is to grow your own food, and by the way, I got nowhere. I went nowhere on it, but
I like to help me.
So I had this idea that kind of came about because of COVID, and in the early days of COVID, it was like dangerous to go to the grocery store to buy anything, right? You want tomatoes, guess what? You're risking your life for tomatoes, right? And it sure didn't feel good. And by the way, I didn't feel good about a lot of the grocery shopping we have to do even before that, because we go in and we see, oh, look, the avocados are shipped from Mexico, and the pears come from Portugal, and the cucumbers, and all of a sudden you realize how much greenhouse gas is used just to get those vegetables to you. And so I started thinking about that problem a little bit, and I've come up with a couple of ideas, but I don't even know how to begin to test some of the ideas, short of building things, which is what my nature as a developer-focused type person would do. But how would you go about testing? Do people? I think I have a way to grow a decent amount of produce in a very small footprint, inside of a house, and it's not the typical hydroponics type package you buy, and wow, you can grow 6 herbs at once, which doesn't change much, right? But it's more of something a little bit more. I don't even know if people would be interested in the idea or not, and it's craziness. So that's why I got to help me, Dave. Help. But how would you go about something like this?
Yeah, it's interesting. I went to one of the first Lean Startup conferences I ever went to. There was a talk from a couple co-founders that were talking about growing mushrooms in their house, and not psychedelic ones, right? They're the kind you eat, edible. And they were like going through how to test through the packaging and where to get sort of the soil even. And, they just kept testing with customers and doing research, and they realized you could actually take coffee grounds from like Peet's Coffee and Starbucks, where they throw them out. They were able to say, hey, can you just give those to us instead of throwing them out? And so they kind of created this thing where they had like a few cafes, they would go and they would take the waste, and then they would use that in their packaging. And then people started believing or buying into this approach of like, oh, we're using sustainable stuff. Like that would go in a landfill, but now it actually helps me grow mushrooms, So there are all kinds of really interesting approaches you could take. I would say the biggest one is getting beyond, just trying to understand what the fears that people have of not doing this now. Is it that they're just overwhelmed, they don't know how to do this at all? Is it they can't grow enough? Is it they've killed things off in the past and they're afraid of trying again? Like there's a lot of really cool customer kind of facilitated exercises I think you could do to start to understand like what's that combination that you would start off with, and then kind of growing out from there. But I would do a lot before even prototyping of just what kind of facilitated conversations can you have and research can you do. Even online, you could look at people searching, like, is anybody searching how to grow home, like food in their home? Like all that's publicly available over Google Trends and keyword analysis. So there's a lot you could do before getting even to the prototype stage. Okay, cool. Yeah, that's a cool idea. So yeah, I mean, again, just getting you a little practice here. I know this style of working isn't for everyone, so it's okay if you're not on board with this. But basically, what I end up doing with companies is, sketch out what your strategy is and then move into okay, how do we actually go test that and like find if we're on the right track? So it's basically just like scientific method applied to business. And I pull everything I learned from Agile into this kind of working as well. So maybe a couple questions. So maybe we have a couple, I want to make sure we don't keep people over as well, but we have one here. How do you identify and overcome biases that people bring when participating in tests? So there are kind of three big biases that tend to come up when I'm doing this work. One is confirmation bias, which is more like you're just confirming your own beliefs and you never really set the bar high to challenge your beliefs in any way or do any kind of null, hypotheses where you're trying to prove yourself wrong. I try to watch out for that with teams where they just kind of want to go through the motions and, if 1 out of 10 people said they wanted, that's enough for them to go build because they just wanted to build anyway. So I try to help them with success criteria, think through how we set the bar high. But I would say one of the biggest things is just not working by yourself. So usually what I try to do is bring in a group of people. So even in Agile, right? You think design, product, and technology or engineering. Even if you get those 3 leaders together and try to work through this, at least you start getting some overall sort of feedback instead of just doing it in a corner by yourself and going, oh, I really didn't like that answer, and I'm just going to selectively not include it in the results. The other one's overconfidence bias, which is you're so confident that you're not even sure why you would need to test anything, so you just want to skip forward. And then the third one being kind of experimenter's bias, where you're sort of like molding the results to fit. It's a little similar to confirmation in a way. I did a webinar on it a while back. I can always throw the link. I have a free recording of it. I can throw into the links here. But mostly what it comes down to is not doing it by yourself and challenging sort of your assumptions. So I keep telling teams, have an opinion, but be willing and open to be wrong, So be willing to kind of change your point of view based on conflicting evidence, or evidence that conflicts what you believe in. And I think, again, I keep coming back to mindset. So if you're doing this by yourself, it's really easy for these biases to seep in. And biases aren't necessarily usually bad. I mean, they've kept us alive this long as a species. But, when we're doing scientific method, I just feel like people were like, oh no, I'm back to grade school science class and I'm not sure how to, or high school science class, and I'm not sure how to apply this. So what I try to do is just step teams through, like sketch it out. All right, here's what a good hypothesis looks like versus a bad one. How would we go test this that matches the risk so we don't waste our time? So there are a lot of things that, but I don't know if we could ever eliminate biases, but overcoming them, it's usually group setting and, time boxing our work. And a lot of stuff you would do in Agile, actually, in Kanban too, of just, you're not going to run, 15 experiments at once. You're going to limit your work in process and do a couple and wait till they complete and run some more, So a lot of the stuff you all are amazing at, you can just pull into working this way too, I find. A lot of the ceremonies listed in the book look very familiar to you, do stand-ups, do retrospectives. Probably some of the new ones would be things like the decision meetings where you're basically taking everything you've learned and presenting it to a board and getting feedback on it, whether you pivot, persevere, or kill. There's some like new stuff in there, but it's going to feel very familiar to you if you're already working in an Agile way and have some experience that way. Okay, we have one more, I think, being typed here. How do you separate the right problem from the right solution? Yeah, this is one of the reasons I try to do as much as I can without building. When you go through jobs, pains, and gains of a customer and you rank them and you try to dial in, like it doesn't it doesn't matter how amazing your solution is if you're kind of going after the wrong problem. And so I think where I got really frustrated with Agile earlier in my career was we would like work in an iterative way on the solution and we never quite understood the problem. So it felt better. We are using sticky notes, like we're pair programming, we're having retrospectives, but in the end, nobody used what we built. Like we never spent enough time on the problem. And so I just keep pulling teams back of, and this is something I learned from Eric Ries as well, which is, you're really bright people. And if you understood the problem, you could probably build a solution that would solve it. And quite often I would ask yourself, if you're kind of iterating through like sprints worth of work on a solution and it's just nothing's working, then take a step back and say, like, do we really understand this problem enough before we keep doing several sprints worth of like, oh, if we just add this feature in, it's going to be successful. Or if we just do it this way, it's going to work this time. Like quite often we just don't make the space to back up and say, do we really understand the problem? So I tend to early on focus a lot on problems, empathy, like a lot of design thinking, and try to understand, do we deeply understand the problem before we jump to the solution? I used to have this like little diagram where it was like if you know the problem and you know the solution, you can use Agile, or you could even use Waterfall. I'm not completely anti-Waterfall. The problem with Waterfall is like context is lost in the handoffs, and then if anything changes, you're kind of screwed. But you know, if you want to use Waterfall, go ahead. If you don't know the problem and you know the solution, it's pretty much you're going to use Agile to try to iterate through the solution. But if you don't know the problem and you don't know the solution, right? I probably said that wrong. But if you don't know the problem, you don't know the solution, you need some kind of iterative discovery method for the problem as well. So basically, try to apply everything you're amazing at with Agile and iterative, you know, deployment and delivery, right, to the problem space is what I'm trying. And so hopefully this will give you like a reference guide to use. It's not end all be all of everything, but at least give you some new things to try to figure out if you're on the right path or not.
Can I go a little deeper in one thing you said?
Sure.
This hypothesis, the right way to write an hypothesis versus a wrong way. So tell me some examples of a wrong and right hypothesis.
Yeah. So quite often people ask, you know, what's the difference between an assumption and a hypothesis? And the answer I usually say is, well, a hypothesis is testable, precise, and discrete. So it's testable in the sense of it's written in a way where you can actually go test and prove or disprove it. It's precise in the sense of it's really clearly worded, and it's not necessarily, thanks for dragging that down, by the way, whoever visiting Al is. It's clearly worded, and it's not have a lot of vague, ambiguous things in there, like people or customers, like try to be more precise than that. And then discrete in the sense of you're just trying to test one thing, right? Like, it's almost like stories where you say, if it's this and this and this and this, you probably want to break your story up on the conjunctions there. Like, maybe we don't test all this, like we do all this in one story, we break it out into smaller ones. So one of the exercises I do in workshops and online masterclasses is, you know, let's take something that's poorly worded and then let's apply it being testable, precise, and discrete to get it to something that we feel like, oh yeah, that actually might produce the evidence that we need to know if we're on the right track. So the one I typically use is like this AR startup that measures your face, and you can get glasses, you know, precisely delivered to your face, you know, delivered that fit your face. If they wanted to sell data, which ethically we need to kind of really work through that, but if they said like people will buy our data or companies will buy our data, that's really poorly worded hypothesis, right? It's like what kind of companies, what kind of data, for how much, you know? And so if you said something like, we believe that optometrists will purchase user data for $29 per user, right? Like that, at least you're getting to something where you could go run a test for it. So I think that's where people get tripped up, is they word these really poorly, and then they get frustrated about the experiment and they didn't actually like prove or disprove what they had, and then they just give up and go build it anyway. So we've been taking time, like Alex and I have been taking time. Our next online big master class is in December, but we just ran one in September. It was a 3-day event, and we spent a lot of time going through how to word a hypothesis, what does strength of evidence really mean, and try to put a little more discipline around this stuff versus just having people, you know, try things and see what happens, which is usually what I see when I go into a company.
Yeah, quite a bit. Anyone else? Any last question? I know we're getting time.
So I got a question, Alvita. So when you do your discovery experiments, then you go into the validation. Then what? What happened after that? After the validation, do you like do your solution proposal or?
Well, one, it's sort of like the discovery never really completely stops. You know, even when I'm working with teams that are really focused on delivery, we try to do at least some discovery on the stuff that we feel like we're making big guesses on in our backlog. But quite often, we will throw what we created for these MVPs away and build it over. So I think I got in a lot of hot water early on in my career where, I mean, I kind of grew up through extreme programming, and you don't have to convince me that it's not popular or not like actually something we should do. But much like Kent Beck came around to Lean Startup, I think I always struggled with like, why are we writing tests around something that we're going to completely, like, it's just cobbled together to learn and then we're going to throw it away? Because quite often, you know, and this is where I like my inner struggle kind of comes out is like when I'm working with Adobe, we threw all our code away and rebuilt these things in a proper way that scaled. But early on, we didn't make that investment. We just took like the best tech we could and cobbled it together to test it with customers. And then once we knew we had something, we were like, this thing doesn't scale. We don't want to be like Friendster. Like, not to bash Friendster, but we should all be using Friendster instead of Facebook if they have addressed their technical debt issues. So don't try to scale that thing you cobble together, that MVP. Like, throw it away and build it the right way. And I think there's something inherently hard when I'm working with companies of like, oh no, we have to throw that away. I'm like, yeah, like, why would you try to scale that thing we just cobbled together? So after validation, we typically scrap what we have and then we rebuild it based on everything we've learned. And I think that's probably one of the hardest things to convey to leadership and to teams, because they just want to go, well, we can throw 20 more people at it and we'll just like scale that thing. And I'm like, no. Like, we just chose tech stacks that randomly worked because they were quick and we were able to test to get the learning we needed. We weren't trying to put something together that we could scale. And so just be really careful when you show that MVP to like your exec team or your sponsors. They don't know how it's just held together by like duct tape behind the scenes. And so they're going to tell you to just go launch it, you know? And so you have to kind of like frame it in a proper way to say, no, we're actually going to rebuild this thing because this isn't scalable what we have. And so, yeah, so my advice there is after validation, try to build it the right way. That scales, and then don't ever just feel like, oh, we're done with discovery now and we're done with validation now, we don't do it anymore. Because like great teams are always really curious about, you know, if we're going to add something, do people even have a job or want the thing we're going to add? So much like Marty Kagan says and Jeff Patton says, you know, like discovery and delivery, I know it's somewhat controversial sometimes, but I mean, it might be dialed down discovery and you're doing a lot of delivery, but I'm very nervous when teams get to zero discovery or zero. Like, it's almost always got to be there because it never really stops.
Pavitt, do you want to go with the last question?
Thanks so much. Thanks, David.
We can hardly hear you.
Oh.
Do you want to type it or get closer?
Is this better?
Yes.
Okay, awesome. I'll try to speak louder. Thanks, David. This is amazing. Just one quick question. So I was looking through the PDFs. Is there a way to find out like how to do these things more in detail? Because yeah, when looking at the discussion forums and it costs that much, or the evidence strength and the runtime setup, all of those things are mentioned. But are there examples of what way to conduct these, or like the facilitation setup? Are there examples that I could find somewhere?
Yeah, so a couple things. One, those are just summaries from the book that we created, just to give people kind of an idea what's in the book. The book does have more detail, but then even beyond the book, we're creating online library. I'm currently creating videos even this week for that. So quite often, usually people pick up the book and it gives them more detail, and then they go, oh, what software would I use for that? Let me go find out on my own. So the book was almost 400 pages and we still didn't get to everything we wanted to put in there, but we had to cut it off. So there's not a lot of like super deep information in the book. It'll give you more than on those PDFs. And then from there, it's a lot of, well, I would point you to the online library, but it's not complete yet. So you do have to do a little bit of research on your own, because even something like a landing page, there are people that want to create it from scratch. There are also people that want to use like Unbounce or something and use a template. So there are all kinds of different like things to bring into your context there. But the book does have more detail than those cards. And then beyond that, we also recommend, like doing some research, but it's it certainly goes deeper than what I've included there in the board. I just gave you a summary in the board.
Right. No, thanks so much. I'll get the book.
Yeah, one great piece of advice. One great way to date your book is to load it full of a bunch of products that don't exist in a year. So I did not include all the software I use purposely in the book because I do want it to kind of be this timeless thing. So the drawback of that is there has to be online companions to it to, like, you know, that we can keep up to date. It's hard to update the book, so it doesn't have a lot of software. Oh, the book's called Testing Business Ideas. So it's probably there in the board somewhere. There's a link to it.
Yeah.
But yeah.
The link was in the meetup invite. Well, thank you so much, David. This was fantastic. People are saying a lot of good things on the chat here. You are a legend. Trith said you are a legend. So thank you for sharing your legendary experience with us. And I personally love the examples that you have given to us, and a simple way to understand how to actually use them in real life. So with that, I don't know if anyone wants to say anything else, but thank you so much. The recording will be available, and I really want to thank you for your time and sharing all this experience and this link. I know what I'm going to do this week. I'm going to look into that mural, and that's where my week is going to go. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. And let's keep conversations going on our meetup. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, David. Thank you, Ardita.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you, David.